my name is Peter Verhash and I'm creating a video about some very basic Jamal features, a kind of introduction. And if you look at the website of Jamal, and there is a video.adoc file, ASCII-doc file, which shows you that there are already some files, some videos, tutorials about Jamal. So if you want to understand what is Jamal generally, if you do not know, you haven't seen this video, then you have to look at it, watch it on YouTube. The intro, what is Jamal, and then there is a very simple description about how you can install Jamal to use together with IntelliJ. It's very simple. You just have to download the zip file and copy it into your work directory, into the .ascii-doctor directory, the content of the zip file. And there is a video about some fairly complex things, so it's not really an introductory video, but it can give you a feeling how complex Jamal can be, how much you can accomplish using Jamal, how we can modify the documentation of JUnit Pioneer so that it automatically includes the version of JUnit Pioneer from the Git metadata, without always editing the file to include into the sample the actual version. It will always fetch the latest version. Now I'm planning to do this Jamal Basic, and you will see in the file as soon as it's ready, then you will get a link here. So probably if you are looking at this video, then in the file on the website, it's not written planned, it's already the link there to this file. And why it's important to understand what Jamal is, an introduction, because I'm using it, obviously. Why you want to know how to install it for IntelliJ, because I'm using IntelliJ to demonstrate Jamal, because it's a very easy way to use, because if I'm opening an ASCII-doc.jump file and ASCII-doc and jump is configured properly in IntelliJ in just 2 steps, then whatever I write here will appear on the right hand side automatically. So it's almost a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get kind of editing. And ASCII-doc with ASCII-doctor processor is built into IntelliJ as a plugin, and Jamal can be put as a plugin into this plugin, so a plugin of the plugin. And with that one, I can say that without any explanation, I just write here a very simple macro. And voila, you can see that this macro here, A, was replaced with the actual value of the macro as it is defined. In a moment, I will talk about define and what these macros really are. But before that, I would like to say that this editor is ASCII-doc editor, and ASCII-doc is also formatting the code, and we are not really interested in ASCII-doc formatting in this tutorial. Therefore, I will enclose the whole text that we are editing into as a source code. So whatever we do here on the right hand side, we will see that pre-formatted as it has to be pre-formatted. Okay, when we are using Jamal, then we are converting a text file to another text file. The source text file is containing macros, and the output contains the result of the macro evaluation. And macros are intermixed with the text. So if you have a file which doesn't contain any macro, then Jamal will just do not touch it. So like here, if I delete this, then it's just nothing. And the macros are separated from the text with macro opening, and I would like to write with capital letters string to emphasize it that it's a string and not a character. So there is a macro opening string and there is a macro closing string, and this is also the terminology used inside the documentation of Jamal. So macro ending, macro starting, sometimes maybe by mistake, but it's written like that, or I may say that by mistake, but it's a macro opening string and a macro closing string. And by default, there is no by default actually. Jamal itself doesn't define any default. On the other hand, when we want to start processing something, then we need some default macro opening and closing strings. So the application embedding Jamal can and usually defines the macro opening and closing strings as their default value, and it can be changed inside the macro text. But for example, the application which is running as a plugin in the ASCII doctor inside, so what we are using right now, the macro opening string by default, not by Jamal, by the application, is curly brace and an ampersand sign. And here we start a macro, and this macro now named DD by accident, but we do not have such a macro. Therefore, on the right hand side, we will see an error immediately. So it's possible to have something which is not processed. So if there are macros, but they are erroneous, then they will give you some error. So let's say that I put it here and then I just close this macro. And then there is no problem with that, because if I put a question mark in front of a if I put a question mark in a user-defined macro, in that case, if it's not defined, then it's an empty string. That's how I modified it right now. And this is the macro ending string in ASCII doctor when we are editing ASCII doc, and this is the opening string. And what is in between is some macro. Okay, now there are two different types of macros inside Jamal. One is so-called built-in. Built-in macros are implemented in Java. These are classes which implement the macro interface, and they have a method called evaluate, which gets the input of the macro and results some string, which is the result of the macro. We will see what the input of the macro is immediately. And there are user-defined macros. And we will see how we can define user-defined macros. But before user-defined macros, we will have a look at some built-in macros. The simplest built-in macro is simply that says, sorry, nope, I was pressing the wrong button, and sorry. So which says comment, and it starts here, and I'm closing it here. And this part I highlighted is the input of this built-in macro, and the result of the comment macro is on the left hand side you see the project of Jamal itself, and if I come to the implementation of comment, it returns an empty string. So if you can see that it's very simple, it just returns an empty string. So whatever is the input, it's ignored. This is the simplest macro ever. Now if I say that another one which says ident, which means identical, whatever the input is, it returns the input. And Jamal knows from this little sign after the macro opening string that this is a built-in macro. It can be an @ sign, and it can also be a hash mark. And there, oh my god, sorry, because this is the editor for ASCII doc, it was very clever and thought that I want to put double @ signs around what I have selected. So in this case, there is no difference between the two. I will talk very soon about, even in this video, what the difference is between putting here an @ sign and a hash mark. Usually we use @ sign because that's a little bit faster. And also if we use hash mark only when we explicitly want to use hash mark, and if in situations like this where there is no difference, it's recommended that you use the @ sign. But we will see it later. Okay, now what is a user-defined macro? User-defined macros are defined inside the Jamal text itself, and to do that we use a built-in macro called define. and I define my macro without a typo, and this is my macro, and I have to close it. And the result of this macro is an empty string. As you can see on the right hand side, nothing is displayed from this built-in macro. But as a side effect, there is a macro, my macro, defined as a user-defined macro, and I can use it. Why not? And I say that my macro, and there is no @ or hash mark in front of it, and it says this is my macro. So actually what I highlighted is the very first line except the dot. Let's delete that dot, we don't need that anymore. So the very first line is coming from actually from this my macro. And well, the dot is there because it shows that here I have a new line actually. So there is an empty line on the right hand side because it's pre-formatted. As you can see that if I write anything there, then it's there. So Jamal is keeping all the spaces and all the new line characters. There is no difference between a non-new line or a new line character for Jamal. It's not processing anything lines by line. Macros may process things line by lines, but that's a different story. Jamal itself doesn't care about white space. I mean, it cares. It's just like any other character. So here I can use it, and if I'm using it, let's say I am copying it from here, and I'm using it inside ident in the block, then you can see that it's not evaluated. And as I said that I will talk about the difference between the hash mark and the @. This is the difference, because if I change it to be an @, to be a hash mark from an @ then what Jamal does that, okay, I have here, Jamal processor says, I have here a built-in macro called ident, but it is preceded with a hash mark and not an @. Therefore, before invoking indent as a built-in macro, I have to evaluate the input of this macro that starts here and ends here on the line 16. So it starts as a new line, then my macro, new line, built-in macros, new line, user-defined new lines, and so on. This is the input of this macro, but when ident runs, it gets it evaluated already. So once evaluation of the macros inside it are executed. Now, the next thing is that, okay, what happens if I move this my macro from here? Now it's not defined, so I move it here, and I also, well, I don't delete, I just make it optional. And then I say that, okay, I have here my macro, and then I can use it, no problem at all. And since it was used, let's say I want to use it instead of this undefined macro here again, and then we get an error. Why do we get this error? Because every user-defined macro is defined within the scope of its enclosure, and ident itself starts on the line 8, so here, and ends here on the line 18. And what is defined inside is available only inside this scope, unless there are two different things. One is if I define it to be a global macro. Global macro is, every macro is a global macro that has a semicolon, a colon inside. If I precede my macro with a colon, then this is a global macro. And since there is no character before the colon, I can use it without the colon when I'm using it. But this is also a global macro, but then it has a prefix, and then I have to provide it and have to use it there, and then it's there. This is one thing, so that I can use it as with the colon. But let's say that for a moment I am and I am using, you can use it as a global macro. If I define it without and it's a local, then it says that there is no global macro with that name because it's local. So you can use global macros as local because it starts to find it on the lowest layer and it goes up and it finds it somewhere. But if you try to have a local macro and you try to use it as a global with the global name, and then it starts at the top and it says it's not there because it's at a local level. So this is one thing. The other thing is that I can, from the scope where it's defined, I can export a macro. And to do that, I have the built-in macro export that the input for the export macro is the name of one or more macros. And if I'm exporting it, then it gets from that level to the next level, not to the global one, to the next level. Because if I wanted to export it to the global level, then I could just say that it's a global macro with a colon at the start. And this is generally it how we can define user-defined macros, and there are a lot of other things with the define macro, built-in macro itself, because it's very heavily used. It's one of the most important core macros. Therefore, there will be a separate video explaining all the details of define, how you can use it, because there are very many special corner cases. And we won't go there in this video. Where we will go in this video, however, is that I want to define a macro with some argument, and I cannot export it from, because now it's on the global level, on the top level, so I cannot export it. Therefore, I had an error. And I can say that what I would like to show is that macros can have parameters. One or more parameters. Now I have a parameter, and okay, let's say I have this parameter that's I, and then it says, okay, but there is no parameter for this macro named I, so let's say that I define it Y, that's the parameter. And then the use says that, okay, the this is macro, the parameter I is the parameter in the definition, and every occurrence of this parameter is replaced with the actual value, which is Y. And therefore, what you can see on the right hand side is that this is my macro with all the epsilons instead of the original I character. But if I write there I, then I get this is my macro. If I write two I's, then this is my macro, and so on. Now, what we can do actually is that we can define that if I don't have an argument, then I don't care, and I can say that I can define an option if I can write lenient, and then it will not care that I do not have argument for this macro, and it still does. I don't know why, because I am not using it properly, because I need here this sign, and then it will work. And then the argument is simply just an empty string. So this is my macro becomes this is my macro, and it says that macro processing should be lenient and shouldn't care if I do not provide enough arguments. The missing arguments will just be like empty strings. And also I can provide more arguments than there are, and then it simply it says that okay, this is all the argument, then okay, I will do it that way. No. So then this is the argument. Okay, if I have more than one argument, then it says that this is my macro, and if I have more than one argument, then I have to use some separation. And this separation, if there is only one argument, then we don't care, just the first non-white space character starts the argument, and the argument is until the end of the macro invocation. But if I have more than one argument, then these arguments should be separated. And for that, we can use some special non-alphanumeric character, anything. So this I can use differently. So I can use just commas, or I can use just semicolon, or even accidentally I type something different. Then I can type here something different. Why I cannot do that? Because my keyboard is switched over. So and also, yeah. So this is my macro. I'm separating these in a different way. And generally, this is the introduction that you need. And you can have a look at the documentation, and I will create some videos about the different core built-in macros which come up with Jamal by default, and do not need to use some extra libraries which define numerous other macros. There is another video, or at least planned at the moment, about the different libraries and different macro packages that help you to do different things with text file snippets, documentation, and things like that. Whatever we have in the core is some very simple things. We have seen comment, we have seen ident macro, we have seen define, but there are some other things, like you can include a file into the Jamal source code, you can import macros from a file, you can start scripts, you can start a debugger, even you can enclose some part of it, like if it was in one block, with some extra macros like begin and end. And then also you can, we have seen already export, and we can also use a for loop, repeating things with parameters which are listed in the for loop. And there are some other things that I will not get into details right now, because this is an introductory macro. Have a look at the videos that are needed for you pre-order this one. Have a look at the other videos that will widen your understanding of Jamal. And for God's sake, use it, because it may be a little bit difficult at the start. Maybe you need a little bit more effort to create your initial documentation, but afterwards, when you are updating a big document which is having a lot of references to other parts of the document and the source code, if you have all these things included, and if you avoid repeat yourself and copy paste in your documentation using Jamal, then at the end of the day you will get out easier and with a better quality document and with less work overall.